Good evening. My name is K.Atias, and today I'm examining the effectiveness of dropout prevention practices and their implications for intervention with public school students. This dissertation was presented by Dr. Lisa Pollock in 2010 at the University of Southern Mississippi. I choose this dissertation because of my own personal interest in working with students who have either dropped out of high school and re-engaged in their education, or students who are at significant risk of dropping out. These students are often referred to as opportunity youth. I had the pleasure of working and getting to understand these young people at Yesterly High School, a community program and accelerated high school in the city of Philadelphia that was designed to work with this targeted population. In the 4 years that I worked with these students, I gained to know them as resilient, bright, inquisitive, funny and engaging, intelligent, and often challenged by situations that were far beyond their young comprehension. Like the demographics that's presented in this research, the majority of the students that I worked with were African American. Young men outnumbered young women, and they were all between the ages of 17 and 22. The guiding principle for working with these students is to give them a voice, much like this study did, and often what society does not do. This study looks at strategies for reducing the high school dropout epidemic from the perspective of an end user, the high school dropout. I will introduce you to Dr. Pollock's statement of her problem, briefly review the literature that framed her research, including some of the theories that contribute to the development of students as it relates to persisting or not, share with you her methodology and research design, introduce her data analysis and results, and conclude with her recommendation. In her research, Dr. Pollock attempts to address the myriad of strategies that can be implemented at the school level to help reduce the number of dropouts, specifically in the context of the economically disadvantaged student. There has been much research over the past 5 decades in determining why students decide to drop out or not, why some persist, and what can be done to alleviate the growing problem. In fact, at the time of publishing of this dissertation, the high school dropout rate was increasing and expected to continue to rise, specifically among people of color. According to Bridgeland, projected dropout rates can be as high as 33% of the high school population at any given time. Historically, dropouts were viewed as being disciplinary problems, low achievers, students with increasing family obligations, or as having low self-esteem. We also know that the phenomenon of dropping out of high school is generational, and that can be a difficult cycle to break. There is debate as to whether the propensity to drop out is an individual or a social construct, but current research leans more closely toward the direction of a social phenomenon associated with multiple system failures over multiple years, coupled with maladaptive view of self. This study aimed to answer the following 6 questions. Number 1, are there effective practices implemented by schools to prevent students from dropping out? Number 2, what is the impact on student persistence in various dimensions of school climate? Number 3, what is the impact on student persistence of in-school supports? Number 4, what is the impact on student persistence of school intervention programs? Number 5, what is the impact on student persistence of school, home, and community involvement? And number 6, are there relationships between demographic characteristics in the perceptions of dropout reduction strategies? The significance of this study is that instead of researching these questions from the perspective of professionals, educators, policymakers, Dr. Pollock chose to query students enrolled in the GED program, students who have experienced the high school phenomenon firsthand. This group has relevant expert knowledge and understanding that often goes untapped. This study is possibly the first study of its kind that focuses on the insight and experience of high school dropouts, the very population being studied. The study will add to the vast body of knowledge and possibly help to end the conundrum between research and application. There has been very little progress made in alleviating the problem of students dropping out of high school, and while policy and legislation, such as No Child Left Behind, has attempted to address the problem, it has only done so by paying it lip service, and by defunding programs that might actually impact the problem that we are discussing tonight. There is not even a standardized operational definition of dropout, and there is no standard way to accurately report dropout rates from state to state. As educators, we understand that there is a very personal impact on an individual who decides to drop out of school. The average high school dropout will earn nearly half of their high school graduate peer over their lifetime, and even those who return to school and earn a GED will still earn 8% less than their high school graduate counterpart. But this decision not only impacts the individual, it also impacts the community, the economy, and society as a whole. According to the Alliance for Excellent Education, it costs the American taxpayer $260,000 per high school dropout, and that number will exceed $3 trillion over 10 years. The total cost of lost revenue from dropout is $228 billion over their collective lifetimes. High school dropouts are more likely to rely on government subsidies to survive, and are more likely to have children out of wedlock, children at younger ages, raise children in single-family homes, and are also more likely to be involved in juvenile crime. The statistics indicate that the majority of high school dropouts are people of color between the ages of 16 and 24. Most come from poor, inner-city, single-family homes. More often than not, they attend comprehensive or neighborhood high schools. While it might be assumed that black males make up the largest group of high school dropouts, that assumption is actually incorrect. The largest subpopulation of high school dropouts are Hispanic males. In 2008, 45 million people reported being a high school dropout, which is 15% of the total Hispanic population. The next largest group was Indigenous Americans, with historical figures being as high as 35% of a high school dropout, but at the time of publication was hovering around 15%. The decision to drop out or to persist in school can be attributed to several theoretical frameworks, including the theory of transformational learning and constructivism, self-determination, self-consistency theory, and attributional theory, control theory, and delayed gratification. When combined, these form the attributes needed to find success in a learning environment. When students feel that they are in control, have opportunities to construct their own learning, have autonomy, and exhibit executive functioning, they are more likely to persist in school. Despite all of the negative information about the state of high school dropout rates, there has been some progress made. According to the National Center for Educational Statistics, dropout rates have dropped by 5% over nearly 2 decades. So we know that the work is slow, but we also know the work can be done. Even though over the last 10 years it seems to have stagnated slightly, and even in some states increased. There are successful programs that have used the research to engage at-risk learners and dropouts. Most of these programs, such as Ombudsman, OIC Caddy, the Talent Development Middle School, and the Diploma Models, all of these models demonstrate and understand the core components of successful programming: innovative instructional models, intensive social supports, active family and community involvement, accessible and nurturing teachers and administration, and relevancy. However, there is so little research, formal research, on the outcomes of these models, the outcomes of these programs. They show that they are being successful in tapping the ability for kids to learn, and nobody is researching them. Dr. Pollack chose a mixed methods approach for her study. She developed a questionnaire. It had 26 questions. It had 30 questions. It consisted of 25 Likert rating scale questions, 1 open-ended question, and 4 demographic questions. Prior to conducting the study, she piloted the survey with 50 participants, and based on the results, she changed one of the questions. She substituted 1 question. 156 students who were enrolled in the GED program in the Mid-South voluntarily participated in the survey by answering the question, sealing their responses in an envelope, and returning the envelope to an unbiased collector. Participants were provided with informed consent about the study. By completing the survey, the participants implicitly agreed to participate in the study. The quantitative data was collected from questions 1 through 25. The qualitative data was collected from question number 26. Dr. Pawlik used descriptive statistics to measure the average perception of the impact of various strategy constructs: school climate, student support, school intervention, school, home, and community involvement. Question number 26 served as a qualitative measure and was coded based on the responses provided, which were categorized by theme. The responses to the demographics question were measured against each of the first 25 questions to determine whether there was a relationship between age, race, or gender and the perception of the strategies. So there were 156 people who were given the survey. 151 returned the survey completed. You can see just some of the logistics of the actual research design. It's important to note that reliability and validity was measured using Chromevox Alpha to determine internal consistency. The findings from the pilot indicated the need to substitute one question. The qualitative analysis of the following question: are the practices that you believe would be valuable to prevent students from dropping out of schools? The responses were initially listed in order of receipt, and then pertinent phrases were used as the initial codes. Like responses were grouped together to create categories which were further scrutinized and then recategorized into themes. Questions 1 through 25 were analyzed using descriptive statistics. So she searched for the mean response and measured the acceptable standard deviation. Standard deviation was less than 1 in 1 to 1.5. Statistically, she analyzed using the predictive analysis software statistics, and she analyzed that data not only individually, but then again, she also analyzed it against the demographic value codes that were assigned for each of those 4 areas: race, ethnicity, gender, and age. As seen in the graphs, the demographics of the sample are not completely representative of the population that we were looking to study. The number of Hispanic males who participated in the study was actually negligible. So the majority of the young people who participated in the survey were African American. What we found was that there were very few Hispanic males that were actually enrolled in a GED program that was used to do this study. The sample was overwhelmingly younger in age, was overwhelmingly Black, but the male to female ratio was essentially split. There was only a couple of males more in this particular study. So what were the results of the study? So the data shows that certain strategies within a construct elicited more of a response, positive response. In school climate, the most important components for reducing dropout was safe schools, experienced teachers, and out-of-school time opportunities for after-school activities. In school supports, the most important components reducing that the dropout pandemic were tutoring, social skills instruction, and increased focus on reading and math instruction, especially in the younger years. Here's the tables that correlate to the answers on the previous page. You can actually see that most of the subscales were well over 3.0. They all had a positive connotation when it came to determining whether or not they would be appropriate strategies to mitigate the dropout epidemic in their schools. The average, you can see the average overall mean was 3.82, and on a Likert scale that went from 1 to 5. 3.82 is pretty high, and the standard deviation remained for all of the questions actually remained under 2. So, in the first two tables, the highest one was 1.34, which is a pretty good standard deviation when you're looking at descriptive statistics. There's not very many outliers at all. For the next two questions, in the intervention section, the project-based learning, ordinary classrooms, and interventions at the high school level, and interventions at the middle school level prompted the highest averages. And in school, home, and community involvement scored the highest averages around, actually. It was really interesting to see that principals involved with students actually scored the highest. Next was teachers involved with family, and then teachers involved in the community. Those were the three areas where people felt that schools would get, I guess, quote unquote, the most bang for their buck when it came to mitigating high school dropouts. And there is the table for that as well. And again, you'll see that all of the mean scores were well over 3, even 3.5. In the school intervention program, descriptive statistics, we had scores as high as 4s, with which is pretty good, and that is where you do hands-on learning or project-based learning. That had a very, very high score, and even in this construct, the overall mean was, or the average mean was actually 3.65, which was really high, and the standard deviation was less than 1. Okay. And then, when considering whether there was a correlation between the responses and the demographic characteristics, there actually wasn't any found, and so that resulted in a null hypothesis. The most impactful mode of increasing student persistence were experienced classroom teachers, meaningful project-based learning, and involved principals as perceived by these high school dropouts. Those are the 3 most critical areas that they identified as being the most appropriate or having the highest value for working with students that were at risk for dropping out. Okay. Finally, participants responded to the open-ended questions, and the responses were coded and analyzed. The data produced 5 overarching themes: school climate, learning, school-home community involvement, personal decisions, unknown, and social services. These were all considered effective measures that could be undertaken to help schools prevent students from dropping out. Answers that were coded as I don't know or no fell under the unknown category. Social services actually had the smallest number of responses. Here's the frequency and themes of those qualitative responses. You can see these were the top 6, so things that were most important. Caring and supportive teachers, which fell under school climate. 32 of 151 people responded with something that fell within that construct. Fun learning, so innovative learning and instruction came up 22 times. Communication, so whether it was communication between school and family, teacher and family, teacher and student, school and student, community and student, 16 participants mentioned that. No effective practices, personal decisions, 14 people, I don't know, came up quite often, 11 times. And childcare, which I was surprised to see because I thought that would certainly be a mitigating factor for the high school dropout crisis. However, it fell under social services, and only 6 out of 151 people said that childcare would have made a difference. So it was an interesting, I think it was a pretty interesting result. The findings produced several interesting points of discussion. First, this survey had a very high response rate, a really very high, 98% of the participants. And that was pretty incredible. even though it was a convenient sample. So of the 156 surveys that were distributed, 151 of them were returned. So based on that research, the males had a more negative view of education from the perspective of a dropout, which was justified based on research that was previously conducted by Poirazi. Each construct for questions 1 to 25 had a series of subscales. So while all the subscales had an average rating of 3, there were clearly identified critical needs in each of those subscales, as we saw on the previous slide. They were identified as having the highest average rating, and so based on this evaluation, there were 3 critical needs in the fight to reduce high school dropouts. Those were, again, experienced teachers. However, it doesn't mean that teachers with long tenure. So experienced teachers doesn't mean how long a teacher necessarily has been in the classroom. These are teachers who are experienced in working with the population. They are teachers who have been trained to be culturally competent, who have a history of working with students that have a myriad of challenges, and teachers who exhibit sensitivity and confidence to both instruct in their content as well as connect with their students. Currently, teachers that are described below are limited in number, because more experienced teachers usually flee urban schools for less diverse, better resource schools, leaving urban children with less experienced teachers. Those schools typically experience attrition rates of 50% over 5 years. The second critical need is innovative learning. So research shows that innovative teaching, such as inquiry-based learning, flipped classrooms, project-based learning, are much more relevant and meet the needs of multiple learners and embed 21st century soft skills needed, such as problem solving and collaboration, and increase academic performance for many, many students. As highlighted in research conducted by both Kuhn and Dean. Dobson focused his research around the social-emotional context of learning and found that this type of learning has the potential to impact students' emotional well-being as well. However, there is really very little research into this type of instruction, but it makes sense, however, that students are involved in hands-on, relevant, personally meaningful learning, which allows students to construct their own experiences, which is a major learning theory, right? Constructivism. The third critical need was the principal who is accessible and approachable. While we frequently discuss building relationships with students and teachers, the relationships with the principal is not as widely considered, but it was the #1 ranked item in the school-home community involvement. Principals who avail themselves to the personal connection of their students are viewed as interested, caring, responsive. Principals are not just building managers. They must be people managers and relationship builders. Students want to be able to approach their principal for guidance and assistance. Principals must be able to effectively communicate with children, set clear expectations and boundaries, and help students with personal and academic issues when they arise. When a principal is approachable and connected to their students, it develops a sense of connection to the school, which is a component of Ferrucci's control theory. This theory emphasizes the correlation between students feeling connectedness in one or more components of the school and their willingness to persist. This research also communicates the need for earlier interventions. High school dropout prevention strategies cannot begin in high school. It must begin as early as elementary school, even though we may not recognize it as being high school dropout prevention. Strong instruction in literacy and math come up quite frequently. And social skills development are all factors in the early grades that habitually become maladaptive when students become disengaged in school. There have been several studies that support that claim, and programs that identify potential high school dropouts in the very early in the educational career. Programs specifically built with interventions have a stronger chance of changing the trajectory of the at-risk student. Limitations. The study was limited by the size a little bit. This is a relatively small study in the sphere of the population, but it does provide insight into what this population may have needed to find success in school and what they believe was critical for schools to successfully mitigate the dropout problem. This study was also not representative of the population, which is made up of a majority of Hispanic students. Hispanics and Indigenous Americans drop out of school for far more complex and different reasons, focus on cultural expectations and mistrust. The other limitation was the ambiguity of one of the questions. It was question number 16, and it asked about ordinary classrooms under the innovative learning construct. That may have caused some confusion and offered multiple interpretations of the response. This study provided a lot of insight into what students need to persist in school. There are a number of practical implications for this research. Schools should consider what they are currently doing in the areas of school climate, learning, and communication, and incorporate those recommendations made by the study participants with fidelity and consistency over time. So we often find that schools will try the newest and greatest, but they don't try it with fidelity and they don't try it long enough. And when it doesn't work from the onset, they go on to the next greatest thing. They really do need to spend some time implementing any kind of program, with more fidelity and consistency over time. There are programs that have been very successful in implementing interventions and strategies, although there's only very limited formal research around their success. More research needs to be done on why and how these programs find the success that they do. Schools are also limited in the resources needed to provide all of the interventions to all of the students. So community and government partnerships are really critical in providing a range of services to these students. Schools should collaborate with organizations to provide strategic services that can impact their student body, especially those identified as being at risk. Students should reframe how they define school safety. This is really interesting, so that it really incorporates mental and social well-being of the student and not just the physical safety of the building and those who are in it. And finally, schools should consider addressing ways students learn and teachers teach. Students who do not learn by sitting at desks, listening to lectures, and taking notes. We've known that for many, many years. It's not even a good option for regurgitating information at a later date on a summative assessment. In fact, many students fail because of that learning style or that teaching style. Students should be involved in their learning, have opportunities to experience what they are learning, and learning should be meaningful and connected and relevant. Teachers need to be taught to adjust from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side, which actually begins in teacher preparation programs and lasts far into teachers' professional development career. There's also room for additional research. Dr. Pollack recommended that more research be conducted around the intersection of social services in schools, how policy and funding and programming dysfunctionally coexist, the importance of parent training, education, and support. So looking at research from the parent perspective, much like this report looked at the high school dropout crisis from the viewpoint of a high school dropout, it could definitely be beneficial. More research should also be done about the importance of out-of-school time programming as it relates to young adults. This cannot be typical after-school programming, but must work to prepare students for post-secondary education and employment. And finally, incorporating virtual learning as a component of innovative learning and how hybrid models may meet the needs of students at risk for dropping out. This research provided excellent insight into the perception of schools and how schools can better address the needs of students at risk for dropping out. It was important to capture the voices of the high school dropout so that they could become part of the collective conversation. There are people who have experienced it, and so they're really the experts of their own experience. This was an opportunity to re-enfranchise the population in the discussion around education, which may not have happened for many of them in the past. I hope that policymakers and school administrators consider the results of Dr. Pollack's research when considering how to best program for students, and how interventions in order to help them persist with driving toward a high school diploma. As mentioned earlier, schools are businesses with limited resources. Policymakers and lawmakers must take into consideration the funding for intensive interventions schools are expected to provide, and fund them accordingly. Expecting schools to do more with less is inequitable and unfair to students, and schools will not find success without adequate resources, time, and people. If we're going to make rising high school dropout rates a priority, then the system really needs to name that and treat it accordingly. It is time that systems that are powerful pay lip service to the problem and then do very little to support the change. Then finally, schools need to reframe education in their own buildings. Students need adults who care and who are accessible. They need to have opportunities to feel connected to their school community. They need innovative learning experience to build new skills and knowledge. And it's important that students feel safe, that the community and families are invited to help formulate change and intervene in ways that are effective. This concludes my presentation of the dissertation this evening, and I appreciate your time.